Yeah, welcome everybody, including the speakers who are joining today and the extra people who are attending. Welcome. So yeah, we're going to talk about this book just recently appeared, edited and partly written by Shihan de Silva and Beryl Schroff, Legacies of Trade and Empire, Breaking Silences. And the first question would be probably to the editors and participants is how did the title come about, and what was the point of entry?
Yes, so I actually didn't choose the topics in the book. I chose the scholars because I know their works. But in terms of empires, we wanted to include as many empires as possible, but we haven't included the Spanish Empire. So that's something for future scholars to take on. And also we should have could use film as a medium of studying heritage, where the effects of the past can be captured through lived cultures. So what we have included in the book is the tip of the iceberg. And we hope that it will spur others to include understudied geographies in their works, like Seychelles that we've included in our book. And of course, the subtitle, Breaking Silences, comes from my work with UNESCO in Paris, because I was on the Slave Route project for 4 years and the rapporteur for 2 years when I represented Asia. So Breaking Silences is a cliche from UNESCO. But the book itself is a result from a Zoom conference that I held a few years ago during COVID time from this building, Senate House, where I'm based, Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And my aim was to make known lesser known facts about legacies from European empires, because we haven't included other empires. And this was challenging given the spread of the empires across time and space. So I invited scholars who work on different European empires, and it would have to be a heterogeneous group of presentations. So the authors are spread out globally, and they are at different stages in their careers. And they also represent different ethnic groups and gender, so which helps to eliminate the biases in representation. And the objects that the Dutch actually have taken during a period of colonization in Sri Lanka for 150 years are now on display at the National Museum in Colombo, and I saw them last week. So hopefully this would spur other countries to follow suit. Behrooz, now I think you can take over and introduce the authors and the chapters.
Yes, thank you, Shihan. So, I'll go through the chapters of those who are not here, perhaps, and start with the first chapter is by Uta Fendler, who is Vice Director of the Bayreuth Academy of Advanced African Studies and co-director of the Cluster of Excellence called African Multiple at Bayreuth University. She's not here present, but her chapter looks at the power structures of colonizer-colonized relationships through creolization and chorale identity. Chorale identity represents a symbiosis between plant and animal, and each requires the other to exist, by which differences are negotiated into a harmonious unity. The next chapter is by Marie-Christine Parent, who earned her doctorate in ethnomusicology from University of Montreal, Canada, and from the University of Côte d'Azur in France. Marie-Christine Parent deals with the music in the island of Seychelles. She discusses two musical genres, Sega and Mutia, that come together as a Creole continuum called Sega Mutia. The next chapter is by Frederick Noronha, who is here with us today. Frederick Noronha obtained his PhD at the University of Goa, and his chapter is on the first Gutenberg printing press in Asia that was established in Goa in 1556 He has called his own press Goa 1556. The next is my chapter, which I will speak about. I'm affiliated to the University of California, where I teach as a lecturer in the Department of Asian American Studies. I'm also a documentary filmmaker, and I've worked extensively on African-descended Siddhi communities of Gujarat. Currently, I'm working with the Siddhi community of Karnataka. Our next contributor is Tom Hooger-Vost. He will speak about his chapter. He is a historical linguist who is based at the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. His chapter is on Indonesian food practices, but he will talk about it. Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya, our co-editor, is also present here, is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, School of Advanced Study at University of London. She's a Senior Associate at the Lucy Cavendish College at University of Cambridge and lecturer in the Faculty of History at University of Cambridge. She's an elected Fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, Great Britain and Ireland, and collaborative researcher at University of Colombo and chair of the National Committee of Intangible Cultural Heritage, ICOMOS, in Sri Lanka. She will talk about her chapter on Leonard Woolf's novel, Village in the Jungle. Our last scholar is Shin Lee, who completed her PhD at Bayreuth University in Transcultural English Studies. She's currently lecturer at the University of Shanghai, Maritime University in Shanghai. Her chapter deals with the Canadian African writer Marlene Nurby's Phillips literary work, Looking for Livingstone, An Odyssey of Silence, where Shin Lee explores issues of silences and silencing mechanisms under colonialism. And with that, I pass it back to Neil. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So, I propose that we might discuss several chapters in the order of the book, so that I would like to start with Fred. But first of all, I think the idea of the book conveys also that each of you took a specific topic, but from that, each of you expand to a much wider field, so that as a whole, the book covers much more than the sum of the chapters, you could say. So it's like a drop of oil on the sea, covering the whole ocean, with the most central ocean being the Indian Ocean. So yes, Frederick, if I may start with you, you underline the importance of the first printing press in Goa and how important it has been, while also we nowadays, especially due to the Anglo-Saxon dominance in academic studies, and the importance of Goa and the printing press has a bit been forgotten. How can you elaborate a bit more on that? Fred, are you there? I think you didn't put on your microphone.
Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Neil. Basically, the point I was trying to make is that in this full debate about South Asia, understanding South Asia and things like that, within South Asia itself, there are kind of rain shadow regions which are not covered at all. So there are pockets like large peripheries within this region which itself doesn't get a proper hearing. Within the region itself, there are areas which are not kind of looked at. So I think Goa is one of them. Of course, there are many of these small pockets. Goa is not the only one. Since I'm based here, I kind of find it convenient to study, and I know the region, and I'm struggling to understand it. So in that sense, I thought it was interesting.
Yes. Were there more printing presses around in the wide region, around the Indian Ocean, or was Goa one of the first?
It was the first in Asia, actually, due to a historical accident. the printing press in Goa didn't play the role of printing in Europe because it was a kind of a colonial kind of endeavor. So in that sense, it wasn't, you know, path breaking and meant for enlightenment and the spread of knowledge. But it did play a very interesting role in different ways, not just the spread of religion, though that also was on the agenda. It also played a important role in terms of spreading information about plants, plant-based medicines, you know, geographical maps, and also languages in that sense. So that was one of the points I was making. So strangely enough, there were very few printing presses in the 16th century, mid 16th century, not just in Asia but in many parts of Europe also. So, for instance, Goa's press reached here before it reached, say Moscow, for example, and it came here by accident. As I said, it was supposed to go to Ethiopia, what then was Abyssinia, and due to some historical accident, it reached here. But interesting nonetheless.
Oh yeah, yeah. You wrote that it was the Portuguese missionaries wanted to bring it to Abyssinia, but for some reason they brought it in the end to Goa as a sort of in between, and then it stayed there.
Right.
Yeah. Then in which languages was the press working? And then you said also, right, it's not soon they printed much more than only about religion.
Yeah.
Well, originally was probably intended to print Bibles.
Yeah, that too. It was basically being printed in Portuguese at that time, maybe a little bit in Latin, but they were struggling with Indian languages, so
Yeah.
that didn't happen. Because of the types and typography, and it was quite complex and too difficult for them to manage. And of course, the goal of giving prominence to the people's language wasn't on the agenda here as it was, say, probably in Europe at the
Yeah.
time of the Reformation and things like that.
Yeah, it's
So
interesting
in
that
that sense, yeah.
in the Reformation, the revolution Luther introduced was to print the
Yeah.
Bible in
Right.
the people's language. So in a way, Goa automatically implemented this revolutionary thing, which originally Catholic Church.
No, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that it wasn't on the agenda here for two reasons. One, it was the power equation was very different here. The purpose of it was different. And the third reason probably is that typography was difficult to work with in Indian languages in any case. So, there are three reasons why it worked very differently from the way it influenced Europe, for example.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if they printed for a part in Portuguese.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
which in Europa would have been frowned upon, because in Europe, the Catholic Church originally wanted to print only in Latin, which the people could read. And so in a way it was a half revolution, although they didn't go as far as to print in local scripts.
Yeah. What I'm arguing is that it was the law of unintended consequences. So while the intention may have not been radical, it did have some interesting consequences which were not intended, including the spread of knowledges about languages. For example, some of the first grammars were written on my tiny language, which is called Konkani, but it was written in the Roman script. So they changed the script to make it doable. A whole lot of things happened.
Yeah. And how was the level of literacy in the other languages, in the local languages? Were there enough people to read it?
That's very complex. That has been a complex debate till 1961, where people would point out that the number of persons who spoke Portuguese was not more than maybe 10%. But I think that it's more complex than that, in the sense that in Asia, in our parts of Asia especially, many smaller languages tended to be oral cultures. So to expect, to transplant a European model here is not going to happen so easily. But at the same time, even the fact that you have a grammar in your language makes a huge kind of change, because it suddenly, codifies the language in a very print kind of sense, if you get my point.
Yeah. And then part of the chapter is also how, due to the dominance of English language scholarship, Goa's role as a pioneer in printing has been overlooked since then anyhow.
Yeah, that's true. So that is more a recent kind of phenomenon, and also in the, say, 17th, 18th century, by which time the Portuguese were not seen as a serious contender for colonial power, even in a South Asian context. So their stories would not be focused on. And after 47, after independence in India, the kind of British biases seem to have been passed on to the post-colonial state in that sense, no? Because it's when you talk about South Asia, you're mostly looking at English and scholarship in English and those kind of things. So that still dominates till today. So that was my kind of sub agenda, if you want.
Yeah. And has Lisbon been interested during the centuries to maintain relations with the Goa Press and what's being printed in Goa? Even
No, actually, that is a kind of a complex equation, because, as you know, the parting of ways in 1961 was not as friendly as, say, with the Brits or something like that. So you've had a situation where there was a break in communication, and then the languages got changed, overnight almost. So people changed the language. So the communication has not been very strong. Now there are efforts to like, there is a academic network which is looking at the colonial press in all the former Portuguese colonies, but because of the shift in languages, so my argument is, in the 20th century itself, Goa has seen at least 5 shifts in languages of dominance within those 100-year period. So because of that, it kind of complicates what is possible. And today everyone has shifted over to English and those kind of things.
Yeah. Then also I was fascinated by, I got introduced through you by this fascinating person, Garcia de Orta, Portuguese Jewish physician, herbalist and naturalist. Actually, I also found out that in Portugal, he had already been a very considerable, important medical figure. He had even been the medic of a king or a prince. But then he sensed that things might go wrong because of the Inquisition. Even if the family had converted to Catholicism, the converted Catholics would always be approached with suspicion and worse. So that's why a reason he sensed it would be better to Goa. And still, I also read that the Inquisition in Goa continued, and that he might. So maybe you can tell a bit more about his position when the Inquisition was introduced in Goa.
Yeah. That debate has been open for quite a long time, and there have been some very strong studies on the role of the Inquisition, which are now being revisited and probably reevaluated. Not necessarily denying its existence, but denying the kind of severity with which the Inquisition in Goa was judged then. Having said that, of course, Garcia de Orta did face problems. So the relationship between, say, Jews and the colonial state, or to my surprise, I found that even the relationship between the Portuguese and the church, keeps shifting at different points of time. So like, there have been times where the relationship was good, and at other times it was really bad. So Garcia de Orta and his sister also fell foul of the Inquisition and faced problems in that stage. But recent studies are kind of relooking at the role of the Inquisition in Goa, because there's this huge kind of focus on the Inquisition for many decades, if not centuries, of scholarship. So just now, at the moment, there are some books which kind of are challenging that.
Yeah. Is he big in Portugal, as far as you know? He's a sort of Maimonides of his time.
Yeah, he's absolutely big in that sense. I was surprised at the kind of work he had done in understanding plant-based medicines of Goa. And not just in Portugal, there were other scholars who also borrowed, quote unquote, liberally from his work and kind of shared it all over Europe. So even in Goa today, he has a garden named after him. which is unusual, because the trend is, like, in post-colonial times, to do away with these old names and old kind of heroes. But there is a prominent garden in Panjim named Jardin Garcia de Orta,
Yeah. And I might be interested in that. Maybe Tom can look up tomorrow if some of his writings and his books might probably they ended up also in the Leiden University Library, as he had so much influence in Goa and around, while the Dutch were nearby, you could say, in Kochi.
Yeah. So the Dutch later on actually got three Saraswat Brahmins who traced their roots to Goa to help them to translate the medicinal plants, of the Kerala area, in that sense.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Yes. So I think for time we should thank you, Fred, and for time we might move on. There's by the way, for everybody, there's a opportunity to put questions in the chat, and hope either in between or afterwards we will go through if there's any questions. But maybe for now, for time's sake, we should move to the chapter about the cities of Karnataka by Behrooz. And if that's all right. Behrooz, is that fine with you?
That's fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, please. Yeah. So one of my first questions was, and you write about it, but maybe also for the other participants the outside participants. How did most of the cities, the Afro-Indian community in Karnataka, how did they get there? How did they arrive?
Yes. Well, some historians trace the fact that there are Muslim, Hindu, and Christian Siddhis to different trajectories. For example, the Muslim Siddhis may have gravitated towards the forests of Karnataka from the Deccan area, where they worked in the kingdom of Bijapur, or they were working, as was Malik Ambar, in the Deccan. And they could have been runaways, or many different reasons why they might have come to the forest area. Those are the Muslims. Then the Hindu Siddhis could be traced to the Omani Arabs who sold, and Indian merchants who sold them to Haivik Brahmins. And so they adapted Hinduism in the forest area. But most of them are from the Portuguese area that gravitated towards the forests of Karnataka. And then there are Christian Siddhis who did come from the Portuguese territory. Many of them escapees, runaways, because the Portuguese had treaties with the neighboring kingdoms saying that if you capture any of our slaves, we will charge you, so you may as well return them to us. So there was this kind of treaty signed, and I don't know how many were returned, but I think none were paid for. But many then sought refuge deeper into the forest areas instead of staying in the neighboring areas. So those are the three ways of tracing the trajectories of Hindu, Muslim, and Christian Siddhis. But of course, there were also merchants who had come earlier, before the Portuguese, during the time of the Arab trade, who came voluntarily. Many came to India voluntarily, particularly to Gujarat, and then traveled downwards into the south area.
So you write explicitly in your chapter that you limit yourself to the Karnataka cities, and because in other states the trajectory might have been different. Yes. But indeed in the Gujarat it's often written that they came as traders and then stayed there, settled there. So that would be a difference with Gujarat.
Yes, yes. In fact, Gujarat had more much more voluntary migration
Yeah.
than the slave trade.
Yeah. By the way, recently I read that was 4 or 5 years ago that the Amsterdam University libraries had released a series of documents about the Dutch slave trade from on Kerala, so that the cities in Kerala might have come there partly not only through Portuguese but also through Dutch slave trade.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that is also possible.
Yeah.
Right.
How much awareness is there among the cities of their ancestry?
I think recently, because of scholars coming to the area and making them aware of their African ancestry, they've become much more conscious that they can trace their roots to ancestries in Africa. But I think because of the nature of survival in these areas, economic survival, and just socially, they are so invisible that they tend to concentrate and focus on the daily living. So the younger generation, because of social media, is definitely more aware. They have been looking at Afro-Caribbean music, they have been looking at reggae, rap, and in that sense, they feel a kinship to Africa, but they don't know their origins, of course.
Yeah.
There is some scholarship that was done in Goa by trying to trace their roots, but the scholars have not published much except a few articles on how they could trace their ancestry back to Africa.
Yeah, I had to think about apparently there's not yet an Alex Haley of India. The Alex Haley, the writer of Roots, the saga of an American family, who was able to trace back his family roots to Ghana, what's now Ghana.
Yeah, right. No, I don't think there is that kind of sentiment. Also because of lack of resources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe the Afro-American community has been so emancipated that they were able to integrate into academic circles and to start from there to do real thorough research, while in most of the communities around the Indian Ocean of African origin, the populations are in many cases quite marginalized, so they maybe don't have even the tools, the means to start such studies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think the slave trade was on a smaller scale compared to the Atlantic slave trade, where there were larger populations taken over to United States to work on the plantations.
Yeah, although recently there were some studies in the Netherlands, and Tom will also know a bit about them, that the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, earned more from slave trade across the Indian Ocean than the Dutch West Indian Company earned from the transatlantic. But as a whole, the numbers might differ, but or it has been in a process for more centuries.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, is there also in the practices, the rituals, and the music, do they experience a lot of? Are there a lot of traits in Gujarat? It's quite obvious that a lot of rituals, a lot of music, a lot of dances, a lot of religious phenomena are clearly derived from African origins. Is that in the Karnataka also the case?
I think the Muslims do practice rituals similar to Gujarat, and in fact, there are worshippers of Baba Gaur in Karnataka too. There are some shrines to Baba Gaur. The Christian Siddhis who perform the Nash ritual are very influenced by Christian rituals, especially the Pentecostal church which Pashington Obeng has written about, is very much influenced by Christianity. But they do spirit possession, they speak in tongues, so they do have healing practices in terms of the rituals. And I think that connection comes from Africa, memories of healing rituals in Africa. And the Hindu Siddhis follow more or less the Brahmin rituals that they were taught and as they grew up with Brahmin families and adapted to them. But of course, they stayed as an underclass, but they did follow some of the rituals of Hinduism. They do. Sorry? Go ahead. Yes, go ahead, Neil.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, yeah. So, by the way, again, I was recently in Cape Town, and there is a museum called the Slave Lodge, and there you see how in the ships that often gathered in Cape Town, even also Portuguese, before they crossed the Atlantic or before they crossed the Indian Ocean, they might pass through Cape Town, and there the communities, the communities were the subjects were mixed, so it was already on board of a ship very difficult to say that person is from there and that person is from there, and probably it was not registered by anyone at all. So as soon as the enslaved arrived at the port of destination, in one generation, the sense where people originally came from might have been lost. Maybe genetic research might give some ideas, but there was no documentation apparently.
Right. Definitely. There is a move now to do genetic analysis much more, though I don't know that the Siddhis are aware of it. It's mostly the scholars in Karnataka who are trying to engage with this kind of study. Professor Patil did one when we were at the conference in Goa, the Tadia conference in 2006. He presented a paper and he did trace vaguely to Africa, but not to a particular country.
Yeah, it's probably very difficult also because inside Africa there has been a lot of migration as well. So,
right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then a fascinating aspect was how at some point the cities were elevated into the national sports program of India, but that has been also partly abolished.
Yes.
They were to lift them up socially.
Yes, right.
They engaged in sports programs.
Yes,
and what's left of that?
Yes, many took the benefit that was offered to them, the opportunity that was offered to them by an IAS officer, Mr. BVP Rao, whom I met in Karnataka, who was very eager to bring Siddhis into athletics because according to him, they are African, supposedly African, and that they are capable, they have it in their DNA, which is, of course, as you pointed out at one point, that it's a kind of racist assumption.
Yeah.
But the young people took willingly to this opportunity, though the parents at first were a little reluctant, but they were given some monetary compensation. So that helped the parents to send the children off. They were taken to Bangalore, they were trained there, and the program worked very well. But somehow the Sports Authority of India backed out of this program and left the young athletes puzzled. Though many of them, because of their training in the sports area, were able to get jobs. And they... Yes, they got jobs in government agencies, many of them in the police force, like Juje himself, the person on whom I've done the case study in this chapter, then other government agencies like the police, the railways, the post office. So some benefited from the sports, but others were left aimless, like what do I do now? But there is a new movement afoot started by Nitish Chiniwar called Bridges of Sports. It's a private agency. He has brought in 200 Siddhi athletes, and he is training them now for possibly Olympics. He has that kind of aim and vision. So that's where the sports and athletics stands in Karnataka right now. But Sports Authority of India is no more involved in it.
Yeah. Was it even that when it turned out to be such a success, and that in a way, so the Afro-Indians were superior, maybe turned out to be superior compared to the non-Afro Indians? Maybe that was a reason to start to diminish the efforts.
I'm not sure, but I think it was more, it had more to do with government funding.
Yeah, just not
that it dried out. And I think because of the change of government, it could be that that new government was not interested very much in this scheme.
Yeah. Okay. So and there was also they trained partially in Kenya, and did that have a lasting result?
Yes, I think those who went to Kenya got a lot of good training, I would say, robust training, and some came back and became athletic trainers themselves.
Yeah. And what was the lasting effect in Kenya? Was there a sort of growing awareness that their distant relatives lived just across the ocean? That maybe not known.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the Kenya side of it but I know that the Siddhis always feel kinship when they encounter other Africans. They feel a bonding, no doubt about that. For example, the Siddhis in Gujarat, when they traveled to Africa in the Damal group that Amy Catlin had started, many of them said we felt instant kinship with the Africans there. So there's always that sense of feeling close to Africans. For example, they called Obama a Siddhi in Gujarat. Many of them celebrated when he became president and said he's a Siddhi.
Yeah. And there's also some very nice YouTube clips, YouTube films about people from Kenya visiting India, the Siddhi community, and then feeling at home, and then reporting for Kenya TV or Uganda TV about their experiences there.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, many travelers have gone to Karnataka and to areas of Gujarat, like Jambul, for example. That is not so visible in Gujarat. But yes, you're right. There have been travelers who have been videotaping their visits.
Yeah, when you look for cities on YouTube, you'll find several of those films as well.
Right.
Okay, then, thank you, Berouz. Maybe time-wise, we should go on to the next chapter. That's Tom's chapter about the food migration of Indian food across various countries, how the Indian food came to the gastronomy under duress. So it's Indian food practices in Suriname, Sri Lanka, and South Africa. It's a mouth-watering chapter, even for me as a vegetarian, but even then there's a lot of Indonesian food with tahu, tofu, and tempeh, etc., all vegetarian alternatives for meat. So and also it brings us to the country where I'm at the moment, and some experiences I just had here in the neighborhood. And also, I could also mention that the fact that I was recently in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, where there's also, I noticed that an Indonesian snack called krupuk. It's originally, let's say, fried shrimps, made from fried shrimps. You find them in neighborhoods in Jeddah, pre-packed, and that might bring us also to an extra geographical region that might be involved, because historically there has been a lot of exchanges across the Indian Ocean from Hadramaut and the south part of the peninsula with Indonesia. Okay, yeah. So, Tom, you mentioned the warung, which is very much present in Suriname. It's warung is typically kind of Indonesian food shop where you get prepared, pre-cooked, ready-made Indian dinners. And here in my neighborhood, in quite gentrified Amsterdam, if I want at 5 minutes walk, I can find 4 warungs, which also tells something about the Dutch history. Yeah, Tom, can you tell a bit more about this, about your chapter?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. And well, you've already corrected yourself. I was speaking about Indonesian food, not Indian.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
In all 3 of those countries, Suriname, Sri Lanka, and South Africa, I could have done something similar about Indian food, but I think the Indonesian sort of history of colonial era migration is a bit more, let's say, is a bit smaller of scale compared to South Asian and Chinese migration. So I thought it would be a good sort of 3-way comparison. Yeah, you mentioned a couple of very interesting cross connections. One of them being the Arab Peninsula. So I have found, let's say, Indonesian food in unexpected places. For my PhD research, I was in the Maldives Islands, and then I saw that they also had kerupuk there. So, I mean, the thing that food does is it highlights some connections that we don't otherwise see. I mean, it's a very sort of sensorial, emotional level in which people have contact that isn't necessarily documented in archives. And of course, Yemen, especially the Hadrami region, would be a prime example of this. And unfortunately, it's been impossible to do research for obvious reasons there at the moment. But these connections really are there. And
yeah,
yes,
by the way,
interestingly,
you could go to Saudi Arabia, where a lot of Yemeni live. The neighborhood where I talked about in Jeddah, a lot of shops there are Yemeni.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that it works both ways with food a lot of times. So if you go to Surabaya, you'll find a lot of Yemeni food as well, which then gets popular and also gets mixed with Indian food, because there's a sort of broader category of foreign food. And so you get all of these connections, and you get them in the Netherlands as well, as you say. So yeah, the warung, which is a typically Javanese type of food stall, you find them in the Netherlands now everywhere, and I think it's a bit of a success story, because we are talking about well, I called it under duress, but we're talking about people who have often undergone extreme marginalization, and compared to what slavery does, although also talk about indentured labor, you get these inherited dishes that become very, very strong, let's say, elements of one's identity, and also what is being kept and what is being innovated in very specific history. So it's very important. And one of the things I also mentioned is that these traditions, I mean, they are a source of pride of these communities, but these communities themselves typically also run the risk of, their heritage being expropriated by other people. So there could be, let's say, tourism campaigns that make all sorts of beautiful promises, but then the original, group doesn't see any of the money back. It's typically other people benefiting from these very specific family recipes. So that's another thing I put in the chapter. It's very important as well to be cognizant of that.
Yeah. Partly the food travel has been carried by the Chinese Indonesians, and part of that ended up in Netherlands as Indonesian, what we called Indonesian food, but it's the Chinese version of Indonesian food. How much were the Chinese in the trajectory that you describe? How much were they involved? The Chinese Indonesians, so the Chinese community that for generations had been an integral part of the population of Indonesia, although at some point they turned out not to be as integral because there has been large persecutions of Chinese Indonesians, but at least they lived there for centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say there's two ways of answering that question. First of all, certainly in the case of South Africa and also in Suriname, there was a small part of the people who traveled from Indonesia that was ethnically Chinese. And we know this from the archives. I'm not entirely sure about Sri Lanka, but that would have been a possibility as well. There wouldn't be too many of them because you never see them, I guess, but I could be wrong. Shihan, please correct me if I'm wrong, in Sri Lankan archives. But you can also say, by the time these population movements took place, most of the Indonesian islands already had thorough Chinese influence, which predated colonialism, or at least the European colonial project. So things like noodles, soy sauce, it is very likely that Indonesian people already knew about these things and already consumed them prior to colonialism. And certainly when these movements across the ocean took place, they were already part of the Indonesian culinary repertoire.
Yeah, tofu maybe as well?
Probably, yes, but there's no firm evidence, I think, for that one. There actually has been a claim that I probably repeated as well somewhere, that it was somewhere in an inscription, but that turns out to be not the case, a misreading. So we don't have firm evidence of tofu in Indonesia. Unfortunately, we don't know prior to colonialism.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the Muslims would probably not eat pork, of course. The Hindus would not eat beef, and the Chinese would. The Dutch Chinese Indonesian kitchen has been lavish with pork. So, and how's that in Suriname, and how's that in South Africa?
It depends on the community, because in Suriname, for example, a lot of the people with Javanese ancestry have converted to Christianity. So that's a different dynamic.
Yeah.
Whereas in South Africa, Islam is still a very, very important element of the, what they call the Cape Muslim identity. So there would be definitely less pork, no pork, I would say, compared to the Surinamese cuisine. Same in Sri Lanka, by the way. It's, I would say, almost exclusively Muslim. So pork is simply not part of that culinary repertoire.
Yeah, yeah. So I also mentioned before in the notes that I visited Bokap in July, this Indonesian part of Cape Town, where the Dutch expelled mostly Muslim scholars who they feared might be too radical, and they settled in a part of now it's now an integral part of Cape Town, Bokap, and it has still beautiful mosques with a very nice architecture, in elements of Dutch architecture, elements of colonial architecture. But like you also mentioned in your chapter, it has been gentrified. So I didn't notice many original restaurants in that area. where where they would serve Indonesian-derived food.
Yeah, so this is actually a problem with Indonesian descended communities worldwide, that in order to have a restaurant, you need to have sufficient capital,
Yeah.
Which isn't always the case. So what people do instead is they do catering, for example, catering to WhatsApp services or to family networks. So there's a lot of catering, but it wouldn't be concentrated necessarily in an actual physical place. And
Yeah.
so, talking about this Cape Town situation, a lot of tourists would get to eat these famous food items, but they wouldn't actually be made by the community. There'll be people from, let's say, outside communities who try to make it in their own way. And of course, you get these discussions about authenticity and all that. But it's mostly these kind of socioeconomic problems, but people in the community, of course, do eat them. And also, interestingly about this sort of history, if you read sort of Dutch colonial archives, they always talk about radical people, as you say. But of course, to the communities themselves, these were heroes, and these were arguably sort of anti-colonial heroes as well, because what they
And
did...
intellectuals.
And intellectuals, yes, indeed. So Sheikh Yusuf, for example, essentially defied the Dutch East India Company 3 times, and were terrified of him. So he was banished to Sri Lanka first, but then he came back
Like
and
Napoleon.
started sort of, of course. And then eventually he ended up in South Africa. So it's sort of a transoceanic connection there going on as well.
Yeah, and outside the gastronomy, an interesting aspect of the Bokap community was that they started to speak Afrikaans, maybe because it was close to the language of their former of their rulers in Indonesia, and they continue to write Afrikaans with Arabic script.
I would say I would invert that logic and say it was actually these communities in the Western Cape that created Afrikaans, whereas their, let's say, colonial rulers would speak Dutch.
Mm. Afrikaans was already sort of half creolized Dutch in a way.
Yeah, in a way, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
with a lot of Malay loanwords in it.
Yeah. And then they continued to write with the script they knew as scholars, Islamic scholars. So you find the so-called kitab there, and these are books written Afrikaans, but written with Arabic script.
Yeah, and I think a number of families now in the Cape are working on a digital library. So hopefully that will be available to the community and, of course, to everybody interested soon. But there's a lot of manuscripts still circulating, and people, let's say the younger generation, sort of is very interested in retaining that heritage. So this is alive, which is good, of course.
Yeah. And it also shows how many ramifications your topic has in all walks of life in the various communities.
Yeah, and also to come back to the previous point of people now using the internet and seeing, okay, the African descended communities in the US are doing something. That is, of course, going on here as well. So people have people are aware of, say, videos and clips and things of recipes, all of that from Indonesia. They know exactly how their cuisine resembles, but also is different from Indonesian and Malaysian cuisine. So I'd say the dynamic is now completely different because it's much easier to connect now.
By the way, there's a very interesting young artist, Tanya Peters. She's from that community. And when I saw her work first without Yeah, and when I saw her personally, without knowing much more about her, I thought she might be from that community because she has Indonesian looks. While being from South Africa, in her work, you see images of Bokap where I had never been, but you see some things that relate to her Islamic background, although she's not very Islamic, I think. But it's so, yeah, you might encounter the name Tanya Peters at some point. It could. She's quite often in the Netherlands, so you might be interesting to. She might be interesting for you to get in contact with.
Yes.
Okay, and then yes, thank you. And then I would like to switch to Shihan, if you like. And you write the chapter about the Leonard Woolf's novel Village in the Jungle and how it was perceived in Sri Lanka and what the current meaning of the book.
Yeah, so all right, so The Village in the Jungle actually was my O-level text, the Sinhala translation, but the English book is taught at A-levels and in tertiary education in universities. But the novel actually grips me because, from a personal point of view, because the area that Leonard Woolf, I think, found himself, the southern province, is the area that my ancestors come from and where I spent a lot of time during my childhood. So the sea, being so close to the sea and being in an isolated area, that really I can empathize with Leonard Woolf. But having said that, his novel, published in 1913, is not that well known, not as well known as E.M. Foster's Passage to India, published in 1924, and George Orwell's Burmese Days, published in 1934. And the other novel in the same category is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and that was in 1899, before Leonard Woolf. So I think the beauty of Leonard Woolf is, as I say, it's a code for decolonization, the book. In 1911, in the height of the British Empire, he couldn't advocate the distaste that he acquired for imperial rule in Sri Lanka. He couldn't advocate decolonization. So this is a way of saying that here are people who were capable of self-rule, as he saw the paddy fields, the dried out paddy fields and the irrigation works. He goes back to England, he meets Virginia, he resigns from Virginia Stephen, the well-known writer, and he resigns from the service, and he retrospectively writes the novel. So scholars, of course, have a different view about Leonard Woolf. Some say he's imperialistic, but my argument is different, that he's anti-imperial. He's someone who actually, because he learned the Sinhala language, and more than the Sinhala language, the jungle village idiom, which he uses in his dialogues, is amazing, that he could cross over to the minds of the colonized, empathize with them, and then write a novel, depicting the power structures, what they went through, the local power structures and the imperial power structure. So they were caught between two. And as a linguist, of course, I was attracted by his mastery of Sinhala. So from the words that he used in his novel, like swear words, exclamations, kinship terms, food, flora, fauna, surnames, personal names, honorifics, and occupations, temporal elements, weights, and measures, as Tom, as a linguist, would know, these indicate kind of bilingualism. In the case of Leonard Woolf, he was multilingual, he knew Latin and Greek before he went to Sri Lanka. Yeah, so you would say that in the sense of what Edward Said coined as Orientalism, he went much further than what the persons Edward Said accuses of Orientalism. He was much more deeply involved. It was not just an outside layer, far from that. Yes, because perhaps his sensitivity was developed because he himself was on the cusp of being an inside-outsider. He was an Englishman. Sri Lankans see him as an Englishman. and not as a Jewish person. But within the service, I mean, in the Bloomsbury set, he was never exactly one of them. So others were, Anglo-Saxon English people.
Yeah, and
So-
the British in general would consider him as a half outsider, him being Jewish. So
yes,
he
and
might have
Yes.
identified easily with the colonial victim in a way.
yes. And also it says something for scholarships where we are taught to think of things in binary terms, but it doesn't work like that. There's an in-between.
Yeah, and were Forster and Orwell aware? Probably they were aware of the book.
Yes, they knew each other as well. At least
Okay.
E.M. Forster did.
Personally as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
He wrote a second novel, which E.M. Forster read the script and said, you shouldn't publish it. Yes.
And then in more detail about what you write that he also met Arabs in the pearl fishing business. How did he perceive the Arabs, and who were those Arabs that he met when he was supervising the pearl fishing business?
Yes, that's an interesting question, which scholars might like to look into, but I haven't looked into that part.
Yeah.
I mean, he
Yeah.
wrote many books. There are his biographies and many books, a second novel, short stories, and there are many aspects. And I've always got to introduce him as Virginia Woolf's husband because they don't know him, first of all. And then when they know him, they think he's three different people because he's known in the world of international government. The Labour Party, the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, and then the Goa Press. He was a writer, and then he was this civil servant.
Yeah. Until around the turn of that century, the Gulf was the heart of the world's pearl fishing business. But then Japan invented, let's say, not artificial pearl making, but I mean, induced pearl making in a sort of a laboratory situation instead of trying to find natural pearls just around the water by chance. So I was interested to see how far that pearl fishing business went in Sri Lanka, where apparently the conditions on the sea are similar to what we call the Persian Gulf. So that raised some curiosity.
I've been to
known about it. Yeah.
Yes, I've been to Manor and seen the ruins of. I have a picture in the chapter, the Doric house of the Frederick North, the first governor's house there. It's amazing. It was flourishing at the time, the pearl fisheries. But after that it just died down. The Japanese simulated pearls. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They are natural, but they're not from nature. Yeah. Yeah. I also made a parallel with the Dutch novel Max Havelaar by Eduard Douwes Dekker. It was a novel from 1860 by Multatuli, or the pen name of Eduard Douwes Dekker. And it's, in a way, Multatuli takes up, seems to have taken up a position similar to that of Wolf. Engaging with the local people, sympathizing, being empathic to them, but on the other hand, still being part, even in his critical role, being part of the colonial system and not fully abandoning the colonial system.
Yes,
but like Wolf, Douwes Dekker also left Indonesia and had enough of it, so he that was his way of resigning from this position.
Yes, so that's an interesting parallel from the Dutch Empire. Thank you for telling us about that. But in the British Empire itself, I found that when I was a visiting fellow in the University of Cambridge, and I was an insider, if you like, I could access the other archives. So I went to Trinity College, which is Leonard Woolf's college, and that is the most prestigious college where he was an undergraduate. And the librarian told me brought me a correspondence, a letter, and said, if anybody is researching Leonard Woolf, they should also look at Sir Malcolm Darling. So I went to the Institute of South Asian Studies and looked at the manuscripts there. And I found that here was another Englishman who served this time in Punjab in India. And he was concerned about the Indian peasants. So, and he has written a book called The Apprentice to Power, published in 1966, if anybody is interested in researching that. So yes, so there were people, this is what I wanted to show, that some people in the empire were different. It's not just them.
You mean
and us.
1866?
Yeah, it's not just colonizer and colonized, it's more than that. It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah. So yeah, and how is the novel? Is the novel still well known? Apparently in Sri Lanka, it's still influential. How known is it still in the British language region?
Yes, it's taught at secondary and tertiary level in university.
Okay, yeah. So that makes him just as relevant almost as his wife.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we have to keep an eye on the clock. How much time do we have left?
45 minutes.
Oh, I thought we have 2 hours. I thought 1.5 hours.
Yes, so we've been on it for 1 hour and quarter.
Yeah.
So we have 45 minutes or
Okay.
less if it wants to stop.
Yeah. So yeah, what are next pressing issues that you would, if there would be a future edition of the book, a follow-up, or even an online version with more chapters? What topics would you like to include?
I think Behrouz and I worked quite hard on this book. We're quite exhausted. We can't think of another follow or sequel to this on the same topic. But I myself am working on another book called Global Portuguese. That's out of 3 years of conferences that I organized in the Institute of Modern Languages Research, and it's 14 chapters. So it's twice the size of this book. And it's pretty exhausting, I can tell you, dealing with 14 authors and writing the introduction and to the epilogue. So I'm sure Tom will appreciate it as well. He must have gone through the same experience.
Yeah. So, what will it cover?
Sorry?
What will it cover? This book you're working on in parallel?
At the moment, I'm working on Global Portuguese. So it's from a linguistic point of view, but language and culture. So, with 14 chapters. And of course, there's Portuguese Africa, there's Brazil, and Portuguese Asia. And there are Creole languages in Portuguese Asia. Forgotten, marginal.
Yeah. And maybe I would like to add that because publishing is now scarce and everything is online, publishers are not picking up manuscripts very easily. And then they are putting the burden on the editors to do a lot of work, which is why Shihan and I had to do a lot of work for this volume. And for a previous volume that I had worked on with Ken Robbins, Jasmine Graves, and Omar Ali, it was really hard to find a publisher. Of course, it was a 3-volume set, but with things going digital, publishers are not ready to pick up manuscripts unless it is going to be an academic text and it's going to be used very widely. So that's the other thing we are up against in this scholarship.
Yeah, whatever gets printed tends to be quite pricey, quite expensive. And so you have the vicious circle that less copies are being sold, so that makes publishers less eager to publish. But then what's being printed is still taken the most serious.
Yes, I think journals are doing a better job. Journals that are attached to universities. And Shihan is currently editing a journal with a theme on the Indian Ocean world. So that's where I think a lot of publishing is possible, to do brief articles.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, journals reach less people than books do. So that's the point. And also, conference papers don't really get published. So although people work for about 9 months, 1 year from the time they presented the paper and worked at it. So this Cambridge Scholar Publishing is one of the rare people who publish conference papers, but we had to put a proposal and get it okayed. Get it reviewed and then get the final acceptance.
Yeah, and Fred adds, which is why we perhaps need to look more at the open books model. Fred, can you tell a little bit more about that?
So actually, although we have been in some form of small alternative publishing ourselves from 2007, I strongly feel that the publishing model is broken, and especially the academic publishing, where a whole lot of academic generated resources are used to create these books, which finally earn little or nothing for the editors or whoever puts in the work and the full system, but it goes into some private publishers kind of kitty. But apart from that, it's also a very kind of hit and miss kind of culture. So if your work appeals, then you're accepted. Otherwise, the kind of gatekeeping that goes on there is very serious, and it excludes a whole lot of people. So it particularly affects smaller cultures, the subcultures. If you're talking the language of co and periphery, those on the periphery get really hardly hit. And in India, at the moment, we have a fairly strong publishing network, which works very well for the big cities, the big centers. But large parts of the country are in a publishing desert in that sense. So, I think we need to re-evaluate. The open access movement was picking up well, but it's not without its own problems. And it's got a pretty bad name now because a lot of hucksters have entered the field. And also, the mainstream is trying to mimic these guys and say we are open access and we'll put out something on limited for a limited time frame or on limited terms or whatever. So like they are kind of beating these guys at their own game, or they are buying up large kinds of open access publishing outlets. So it's a challenging space, but I think we need to rethink our kind of approach to it,
Yeah, the good thing about the open books is that it's more accessible. On the other hand, you can the research often might be less thorough, but at the same time, what is of less quality will be criticized easier as well because it's open. Yeah, and in Tom, is it a loss that recently Brill Publishers in Leiden has been sold to an American publisher? Will that influence the status of the Brill publications?
As far as I know, it won't. They don't really. I mean, the thing is, the people at the top don't really care about what people on a grassroots level are doing. So I don't think anything is going to change in terms of the actual people that we as researchers get to work with. I think that will still be exactly the same way it is now. But on this topic, I was also thinking, perhaps with these open books types of publications, the biggest risk isn't that you'll get criticized, it will be that you get ignored. Critique is actually not that big of a problem because it actually means that people are engaging with it.
Yeah.
But the moment people ignore what you're doing, it's actually a much bigger problem.
Yeah. And do you feel that that's going on?
I'd say so, but there again, there is, as Fred mentioned as well, there is a bit of a center periphery type of problem that, for example, in Indonesian studies, which is my background, I mean, naturally, most of the published work is in Indonesian, and it's free and it's available. You can download it. There are databases with theses of any topic you can imagine, which are completely free. You can download them, but the moment you don't then see them being cited by, let's say, scholars in the fields based on in the global north, then you know there's a problem there as well of who gets to be cited and who doesn't. I think that's also something we need to be aware of.
Yeah, that's part of what Fred. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that's because I am now supervising students in ethnomusicology in Cambridge, and that is something that ethnomusicology itself, the history of it, the beginning of it is to look at the music of the others. So people from the Europe and America, North America, are looking at music of the others as primitive music. So we are trying to break down those. So if you keep thinking that works that come from Indonesia are primitive, substandard, then you wouldn't be referencing them. You might read them and maybe kind of plagiarize them, because those people will never know that their works were plagiarized either. So this is the point. Decolonizing academia is the biggest. That's, I think, what's something that I think our book is achieving by bringing in scholars from various places and giving different people voices, like Fred and Behros and myself are from South Asia. Then we have Ute Fendler, who is German. We have Tom, who is Dutch. And we have Marie Perrant, who is a French-Canadian. And Xin Li is Chinese, so she's a kind of neutral person. So by mixing up all those, it's okay. But normally when you attend conferences, even in Creole languages, it's all non-Creole speakers, speaking about the languages of the Creoles. There are hardly any Creole people presenting papers. I think Tom would have the same experience.
Yeah, but
just to add, if I may, sorry. Just to add, if I may, on the same point that Dr. Shihan is making, I feel that where you are published is more important than what you're saying today. And you suddenly notice that certain books published in certain spaces are being quoted all over the place, not because they are right, not because they are accurate, but just because they are ubiquitous and they are all over the place there. So they are easy to quote, easy to find, but having said that, I think the government of India now, through its academic network, has laid down what sort of journals academia should be publishing in India, like Scopus accepted and kind of things. So that, while the intention may be good, but it causes a huge dependency on the mainstream again, and then you find everyone aiming for the top 10% or 5% of the journals which are published worldwide, which also means that you're not going to build up your own kind of reliance, for the next so many years, because you're just, you think that getting published in a small local journal is not going to be cited, not going to be noticed, and all these kind of things. But of course, I think the book makes a very interesting effort to bring together all these diverse topics, people, backgrounds, issues which we would have never heard of otherwise. But at the same time, there's so much to do because it's such a vast field that we can never be satisfied. But it's a real interesting step in the right direction. Thanks.
Yeah.
I agree with that, but I also would like to echo what Shihan is saying. And I think we all had it in academia, that we went to a conference on a certain group of people, and then nobody of that group was present as a speaker. So they would be the objects of study, and you would see them pictures of them in presentations, and sometimes even as performers, but not as academic participants. That goes on a lot, but it's also increasingly criticized now. So that might be a beginning of something.
And I think, Fred, probably South Asia is marginalized in Portuguese studies, do you think?
Yeah, it works both ways, you know. There are language problems. There is a lot of interest, but because of old emotional reasons or whatever. But I think their language is playing the barrier more than anything else. So, like, if there's a conference happening on the colonial press, and you know, today the language norms have shifted. But at one stage, I was surprised to learn that Portuguese was a lingua franca of much of not just South Asia but also Asia in the 16th century or whatever. But by the time, you know, things went along, we became this tiny place where people were struggling to get published, you know. And that brings me back to the earlier point that Shihan made, that, you know, if we are going to get published in all different kinds of places. I've actually mapped it where all, you know, Goan writers got published in the 20th century, and they've gone as far as, of course, Portugal and London and Rio and Singapore and all over the place. So when you're dealing with so disparate a group of editors, you have to make your story acceptable, understandable to them, which is a challenge in the first place. So today the challenge is something else. People are interested, but language is a problem. Technology is making things a bit easier, but you know, you can manage with Google Translate up to a point. But for an oral presentation, how do you manage? I think technology is going to get there, but slowly.
Yeah. We Dutch have the advantage that we're, after all the British-speaking countries, are among the second best speakers in English. And the same for the Swedes, but in the southern European countries, this is much less the case. And maybe Portuguese still has the stigma of the Salazar period, making it a language of the oppressors. So, well, Portuguese since a long time was now a democracy, but it suffered from that for sure as well. And then there was the problem of Portuguese Timor.
With Portuguese, I find that there's this thing called CPLP, Comunidade dos Países da Língua Portuguesa, Community of Languages, where Portuguese is an official language. So within that network, there are a certain number of countries, and it excludes others like Macau, Goa, Sri Lanka. So, yeah. And then,
Timor,
you know, we do have little Malacca, you know, we have little places, little Luso-Asian spaces. So, and with now we've had standard European Portuguese, then we have Brazilian Portuguese, and now the future is that we are going to have two other varieties from Africa, Angola Portuguese and Mozambique Portuguese. So the four of them will be dominating, but what about the rest? Then is Asia going to be forgotten, you know? All this, you know, like even if you used film as a medium, Lusophone films, African Lusophone films, there are certain groups that are formed. So how are we going to communicate? I mean, are we going to be leaving out Sri Lanka Portuguese?
Yeah. And Timor fought for a long time to keep its independence from Indonesia.
Maybe we have to move beyond language and look at music. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay. Until now, there are no questions from the chats. Yeah. Now, maybe, indeed, for last part, what about the musical trajectories? We can talk a bit about that and maybe use that to reach a conclusion, or at least a final overview.
Yes, that's very interesting.
Yeah. Also, I mentioned in my notes that we talked about Hadramauti influence on the relations to Indonesia. There is a certain kind of music in Indonesia, the gambus, which is very popular, including in Surabaya, the city you mentioned, Tom, which comes from the Hadramaut, and it's performed in perfect Arabic with perfect Arabic instruments. In fact, the name gambus is the name of a predecessor of the oud in the Arab Peninsula, the oud being the modern Oriental lute. But the gambus is a predecessor. It's different, has a different shape. And even when the Indonesian gambus genre adopted the modern oud, which is the gambus is a long neck lute, small long neck lute, and the oud is a small short neck lute. They kept the name remained gambus, and you find it in Malaysia and you find it also in Indonesia. One of the remarkable things is that it has been mostly in our Dutch tradition of half nostalgic memories of colonialism. The gambus music is totally ignored. When you speak to people who want to have this, if there's exhibitions, if there's festivals about Indonesian culture, including music, there's never a gambus. Apparently, the colonizers didn't know what to do with it. So
absolutely, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, so what they would have is keroncong, which is a type of music associated with the Portuguese or the Portuguese descended people, although you don't find it in any of the other places, or you do find it a bit in Malacca, but it could be
compare it to the baila of Sri Lanka a bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's some connections, but with places that Portuguese people married into local families, and that was acceptable to the Dutch elite because it was Eurasian. So it was closer to who they were compared to there's a lot of publications coming out recently about the Arabs in Indonesia, and the story seems to be that they were always distrusted by colonial governments, both in Malaysia and as well as Indonesia. So I think you're absolutely right in observing that the colonial authorities just pretended that it didn't exist. But it's very popular. It still is. So if you go to Surabaya, if you go to weddings of Arab descended people, then that is the music being played still today. It's a very strong tradition.
Yeah, it's also not very well known in the Arab world itself.
Yeah, but I think
it's too far away.
Yeah, but in the 1920s, there were recordings of different gambus ensembles that traveled across the Arab-speaking world. This was, I think, the time that BBC just started. So there was audio material sort of making the same journeys across the Indian Ocean. So that might be a very interesting thing for somebody to look at.
Yeah. I recently also did some research about Kulthum, the greatest Arab singer ever from Egypt, and you find YouTube links in Indonesia with her recordings and everything translated into Bahasa probably. So they acknowledge her as well as a very big star. But again, that aspect is completely forgotten in our our Indonesian colonial nostalgia.
Yeah, we have a very selective narrative. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, I saw also recordings of a concert of gambus music in the Royal Albert Hall in London, which contained, I think, about 4,000 or 5,000 people, and it was full house. So in London, maybe because there's a large Malaysian community, it's known, it's familiar, but here no. Many of the people who migrated from Indonesia here were Christian and partly then Chinese Christian Indonesians, so maybe it has to do with that. But it might be interesting to see if the gambus music traveled with the communities to Suriname. But maybe the communities are too small to support a gambus, living gambus style.
I think keroncong did, and gamelan also did, but I'm not sure about gambus. But I like what is being said in the chat about the musical connections also with Goa, probably also Macau, Malacca, and the Tugu community as well in I think recent scholarship is making these connections between, Portuguese descended but very sort of Indian Ocean-like genres. One example that is often quoted is Cafrinha in Sri Lanka, Cafrinho in Indonesia, where it's now unfortunately extinct. But there must be many more there as well. Essentially musical ensembles that have a Portuguese element, often local or hybrid instruments, but also clear allusions to Africa. So that might also be very much worth looking into, if you're not doing that already, Shihan. I'm not sure.
I think there are exceptions to the rules, because maybe Sri Lankan Catering, for example, where the Europeans would have changed and transformed themselves. When the Portuguese left in 1658, there is no historical record or scores as to what Cafrina looked like. There's no paintings or anything. But only in the late 19th century, we have frescoes about how Cafrina was danced. And it's a multi-ethnic dance. Although today it's limited to the Portuguese burghers mostly, and it's become their traditional dance. So in their wedding ceremonies, after the Catholic priest performs his rites, they have to dance the Cafrina. Until then, the marriage is not complete. So it's that important. But the Cafrina over the centuries has changed from being a couple dance and an Africanized one, and something perhaps like a minuet even, or a waltz. I don't know how it started, but sometimes you see the English soldiers dancing in the barracks, and it's described as a tropical can-can. And then today it's a four-couple dance, something like it's a contra dance, like the lancers and the quadrilles. So it's changed. And the quadrilles and the lancers they had in Goa, and it traveled with the Goan diaspora to East Africa. I know from Frederick, from Noronha, Anthony Noronha, and then the Goan Musical Society in London, like John Paul Kota, when they organize events, they dance the lancers also, but it requires more practice than the quadrilles. So I think the lancers drops, is something that they forget easier, the steps. So it's not always, it's like music of the other. I mean, yes, with the Africans, the music of the Africans, that was the problem with drumming, that it was considered sort of loud, boisterous, it wasn't tolerated in churches. And also they thought the talking drums, the Africans were talking, on board the ships, it was prohibited because they were planning rebellions. So music has different facets, I think. Having said that, ethnomusicologist in University of Aveiro, which is a fantastic place, one of the best places in Europe to study ethnomusicology, and Professor Susana Sado, I'm sure Frederick knows her, has come up with a concept called Lusosonia, and she's mapped a cartography of Portuguese sounds in the world. So that's an interesting concept, because we had other Lusos, Lusoponia and all that, Lusotopy and all that. But here's Luso sound, music. And actually recently that professor in the University of Lisbon and some group in Amsterdam, they've launched out a book on music of Portugal and Spain. So music generally has been under-recognized, more than language, and marginalized in academic studies, but it's perhaps changing now.
Music can be so much easier than language.
Yes, to communicate, it has no language, so it's a language.
You can just imitate the melodies, the instruments, and the rhythms. So it's without having to learn words and complete language systems. Yeah. By the way, how did the word quadrille move around? I recently saw a book about the quadrille on Réunion.
Yes, I mean, in trying to look at it, it originated in England, the contra dances, the country dances, but it was from France that it diffuses.
Quadrille is a French word, yeah.
Yeah. So in the
that
Seychelles,
in Réunion is natural, but it also arrived in Sri Lanka apparently. The quadrille.
Yes, but as my friend Maria Oland, who knows if she's still listening or if she's still there, would like to say something, there are different forms of quadrille. So I've been to Seychelles and seen the quadrille there, quite similar to what's dance in Sri Lanka in particular. So we have different histories, kind of, different colonizers, but they dance in the same dances. So, you know, there are disconnects, as Behrouz would love to say. Stuart Hall quote him as the disconnects and the connects, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, the continuities and discontinuities. Yeah, that Stuart Hall talks about, right? Yeah.
But I also in Indonesia there's a version. The word is clearly derived from Katril. It's Katreji, but you only find them among Christian communities in the East. And it used to be a proper sort of authentic Kadrili, but it now transmorphed into some sort of polonaise. So that can also happen with dances, but also with dishes, that the word stays sort of close to its historical roots, but the actual practice changes, becomes localized, becomes hybridized, something like that. One of the interesting things with all of these dances is that it seems to be the case that they are moved around by sort of people who are neither fully the colonized nor the colonizers, all of these in-between groups, right? So in Indonesia it will be Christians, somewhere else it might be Eurasians, but people who weren't easily placed into clear-cut categories, who might have sort of multiple cultural repertoires, were absolutely instrumental in, let's say, promulgating all of these cultural practices. I mean, I see it with food, I see it with music. So that might be another common thread with all of these sort of colonial histories of these entrepreneurial groups often, that don't easily fit into categories, but are absolutely crucial for culture to be moved from one place to another.
Yeah, for instance, the people on board of a Dutch ship traveling for the East India Company, they picked up crew everywhere where they stopped. So the crew became very mixed. There was probably at the end often a Dutch minority on board, and the other way around, same. So through those passes, all these cultures, especially dances to have fun on land, might easily have moved around, and food as well.
Yeah. But of course, the music of the Siddhis, Behrouz has a different angle. It's associated to religion, kind of.
Yes, right. Thanks, Shihan. The memories of Siddhis in Gujarat, of the healing aspects of dance and music, have distinctly traveled. And they call the dance Goma. And John Jansen, the medical anthropologist, has studied Goma in South, Central, and East Africa as healing institutions that exist even today.
Zar.
And Zar, yes, there is Zar in Iran. So those memories, of course, traveled to Gujarat and gave the Siddhis a way of also anchoring themselves and giving themselves dignity in a country where color and caste is always important. So the healing memories in the dance gave them a way to say, we have inherited the powers of our saint, and we have those powers ourselves. We embody those powers. And in that sense, they formed, according to the studies done by Helena Basu, who is one of the early pioneering scholars of Siddhis, that they reinvented their identities as holy fakirs. And in that sense, the music carries a different meaning for Siddhis of Gujarat.
Yeah. we just talked a bit, refer to zar, which you find indeed in the south of Iran, especially on the island of Geshem, but you also find it among the descendants of the enslaved in north of Sudan and in Egypt. And even in Kuwait, there were remainders of the zar. There, many of the spirits they try to live get in harmony with. That's the idea of a zar. Same like in Gnawa in Morocco, which is also coming from sub-Sahara, south of Sahara. So, and many of the spirits they address have still East African names from Swahili or other languages. Is that still also the case in Karnataka and Gujarat?
In Gujarat, as far as I know, the people who embody and go into spirit possession have not declared any names. And I've also discussed the fact that in Mumbai, where my community runs a small shrine to Baba Gaur, as devotees of Baba Gaur, there are people in my community who do spirit possession, and they do not always claim who they are. But it is taken for granted that if it's a woman, she embodies my Mishra. If it's a man, he embodies Baba Gaur. And sometimes, of course, they declare, okay, this is Baba Abbas. There is one young man who goes into spirit possession, and his father claims that this is Baba Abbas. But there is no identification as such as to who they are.
On Geshem, they are the main spirits or the leaders of the ceremony are Baba Zar and Mama Zar. Yeah. The name Dengomaro, does that sound familiar? Because that's one of the main spirits on Geshem and also on Kuwait.
But the songs that they sing, what are called zikr or jikar in Gujarati, there they of course mention the names of the saints and ask them, they invoke them and ask them to be present in the
zikr is a Sufi
dance
session. Yeah, so integrated in Islam.
Right.
Yeah. But still carrying maybe East African elements, like they still have East African instruments like the malunga and the naganga. Yeah.
Correct. And some of the words in the jikar can be traced to Swahili words or any Bantu language. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's it, isn't it? It shows us how close the migrations, how close enslavement was, and perhaps it was free migration as well. But slavery carried on. It wasn't abolished in 1888 when Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery officially, but it carried on.
Especially in the Arab Gulf.
Mauritania, the last.
Yeah, and also Mauritania, almost until today. Yeah. Yes, Frederick also had a very interesting article about they voyaged across seas to get to your plate. So this is about the migration of the food elements, gastronomical elements. So click on the link and don't forget to read the article. Okay, so what other points? I know that Tom told that he has to leave because otherwise he will be locked into his building.
Yeah, correct. I have 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah. So I think we mostly talked about the topics of the book. Is there something? We also talked about those who couldn't be present here with us. Is there something about the topic, the chapters of those who are not here we should also address?
I think we should, Behrouz, we forgot to put the link of Mari's Sega Mutia. It's on the YouTube. A clip of
Tanu Muge. I
Yes.
can send it around later, but it's a wonderful continuum of Sega Mutia into a different, including reggae music and other musics of the Afro-Caribbean, I guess, that it becomes Sanu Muge. And I have the link. I'll send it around.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, also very interesting is the influence of African on early gospel, which is completely different. No, not so different, but it's in its most original form. It's much more African influenced than what it later became. You mentioned also the Pentecostal church. Is the Pentecostal church not even a sort of white adaptation of the exaltation of the African rights? And that's maybe a reason why so many people of African descent feel at home inside the Pentecostal church.
Oh yes, I think this the Southern Baptist churches in United States have very similar ways of conducting the rituals inside the church, like speaking in tongues.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much what is done in Karnataka in the Pentecostal churches also. And this sense of the healing of trauma that comes into the churches, even in Southern Baptist churches, even in the United States, is very much part of the Pentecostal churches in Uttara Kannada, that Pashington Obeng, the scholar who has written a lot on them, talks about.
Yeah. I was raised, although in a quite liberal way, in a quite Calvinist environment in the Netherlands. And I remember that this Southern Baptist and Methodist and Pentecostal churches were frowned upon as being almost heretic in their approach. So that now, in that hindsight, it might be the sort of the excitement which comes from outside Christianity, imported from almost maybe from the African elements in the American churches.
Right. Yes.
Actually, one of my observations as well in the Netherlands is that Pentecostal churches tend to, let's say, cater to people of a migrant background almost generally.
Yeah.
So, and they even call it migrant churches sometimes, but they're always Pentecostal or otherwise evangelist, that kind of sub branch. So there is these sort of flows coming together as well. Sorry, I have to go, by the way. So I will ask for your permission to leave and then leave. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Tom. I think mostly we have gone through what we wanted to go through. So, is there anybody who would like to add something? Maybe also from the outside participants.
We have Professor Amy Catlin as one of our guests.
Oh yeah.
She would like to add anything. Amy, you can unmute yourself. And Maria Oldland, who is a scholar that Shihan knows.
Was Amy, were you already on board when we mentioned your research in Gujarat? Amy was a little bit later joining.
Come in. I'll let her in. Hasid.
Yeah, Hasid is in now. And Maria, if you would like to add anything. Amy, you can unmute yourself. Well, Amy has done, let me add from her point of view, she did a Malunga workshop where Malungas were actually made for the Siddhi community of Gujarat, and she held a camp where there were the older members of the community who trained younger people.
I have to leave.
Yes, the Mari Chavi Laila. Excuse me 1 second. I have to.
she's looking, while Behrouz is away, has Shanta got any questions? She's using her husband's laptop, I think, as Lal. Shanta, have you got, usually you have lots of questions. She's still listening.
Maybe people already started to prepare dinner after all the mouth-watering discussions about food.
Yes. And in Goa and Sri Lanka, it's reasonably late. Though Fred and I work around the clock.
And this is the same case in India also. Now here is in 12 o'clock midnight.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But I just wanted to add some points. After our discussion with Neil last week while we are talking in the ICTM conference, I'm also in search of identifying the CD community in Kerala. But I don't know whether any particular studies that has been going on within this particular community in Kerala. Do you have any particular comment on this? Whether any community, CD community that's in Kerala? Probably Ami is there. Ami can also add.
Yes, there is the, do you know Jay Chandran? You know her?
Yeah, Nilima Jayachandran, yeah.
So she's the scholar who writes about Papri. Yeah.
Yes.
But you're asking about a contemporary community, not
yeah, I'm asking now I'm asking about a contemporary community.
Yeah, you have to ask Behrouz when she comes.
Yeah. And also I read one book that
yes.
Malik Ambar, Power and Slavery Across the Indian Ocean. I wonder, is there any CD or African descent arose or elevated to these type of political power in any parts of South India than this Ahmadnagar kingdom?
Well, I mean, the first is Razia Sultana. So, you know, the horse, the person, the stable keeper. That's the first time in the Delhi Sultanate that an African is written about. And, you know, there's a film, Razia Sultana, that film.
Yeah.
Then we have in Bengal Sultanate, the Africans rise to power first actually in the Bengal Sultanate, end of the 15th century. So it didn't last long. I think it was about 6 years. It was unruly. They were called Habshis. They were bodyguards and they overthrew the ruler, and there was a short-lived 4 people ruling. And then that is the story that they might have been banished from there, or they ran away from there and came from Deccan, you know, downwards. And then, of course, free, and the most important thing for me is Janjira, because 13th century it was a free trading base for African traders, and that becomes the powerhouse for African rule. So there was free African traders there, and then Malik Kamba establishes Africans there and begins the kingdom, you know, giving the name Janjira, and from Janjira another Sachin emanates. So 2 kingdoms until India's independence. It was 2 princes.
Actually, the Sachin family is related to Janjira, and the British gave them that little principality next to Surat in Gujarat.
Professor, also there is some debate about the origins of the Adil Shahis in that sense, but it's not very clear whether they had some slave connection with the founder or something of that sort, you know. Adil Shahis of Bijapur. No, the question was, Professor Behrouz, of, you know, would you like to repeat the question?
Was the question from Neil?
No, from
Hasib.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, just I'm asking that it's like my...
Sorry,
Malik Ambar, any other African CD community in India. So, yeah, I got an explanation from that already.
Right. Yeah, Siddhi Masood, for example, was governor in the southern area, which is now Hyderabad. Adoni, it was a little principality. There are many other leaders, especially in the Deccan. Bijapur is one, Golconda. Yeah, there are many other names, people who rose to becoming. Then in Gujarat, there is Siddhi Sayyed, who was a scholar and had a library, and who built the most beautiful mosque in Ahmedabad, which has this lattice work, grill work, which is done entirely from one stone, literally, without any joints. And it's like a World Heritage Site in Gujarat. In fact, Ahmedabad was given the World Heritage City status because of Siddhi Sayyed and the mosque there and the lattice work. So there are many other names that I can't think of right off my top of my head.
Hasib was also asking about Kerala contemporary Afro descendants or Siddhis, whether you know.
It's not my area of scholarship, but Nilima Jayachandran has done a lot of work in Kerala. I don't know them. I'm sure that there are communities that are invisible and maybe not even aware of their ancestry, but because of the worship of Kapiris, I'm pretty sure that there is a community there, or there are descendants there in Kerala.
Yeah, you're right, Behrouz. I'm also thinking like that.
Mm-hmm.
It may be unidentified. Some parts of Kerala we can identify the community even today also.
Right. Right.
Actually, what we find is that it depends on the community how they identify themselves. So if there is like scheduled tribe, if there's a benefit of them getting some entitlements from the government, they would identify themselves as Siddhis. But otherwise, if there's no advantage, then they would rather merge. So in Sri Lanka, for example, in Trincomalee, they go as Tamils, the Afro-descendants. And there are as many people in that side as there are in the community that I have been studying on the West Coast. And even on the West Coast, there's outmarriage. And when they go to school, they have to declare their jati. So, they're kind. So they have to say whether they're Sinhala, Tamil. So they have to say Kapiri. And they say now most of us are mixed in our marriages. And we don't like that word Kapiri. So we put Sinhala, but we are Sinhala. And our children in the future, in looks and in every way, they will be assimilated. So it's a bit sad, but it is the reality that they self-identify or not.
Right. Yeah. I do think in Gujarat, they had no option as a community but to identify as Siddhi, because they were, after the abolition of slavery, many were cast adrift. Some were absorbed into the police force. Some worked as domestics in the area of Surat and Bombay. But others had to, through networks, travel towards the shrine of Baba Gaur in Ratanpur, or there are other communities where there were soldiers who, after the kingdoms kind of vanished, also had to suddenly look towards one another and form some kind of community because of the numbers. So they had no option but to identify as Siddhi, or Habshi. At the time they were called Habshi.
It's interesting what you said about they have jobs in government jobs, post office, railways, and so on. And the same pattern is in Sri Lanka as well, the Africans. So after they were freed, and they do get jobs in the tall pans, cement factories, police, postal services as postal runners. Mm-hmm. So that's quite an interesting thing that, one wonders whether they were better off under the colonial regime than under independence. What do you think?
Those jobs, was that in the British rule?
Yes, that was in Sri Lanka, British rule.
Yeah. And while in pre-independent India, the small little kingdoms, the small states, where they worked as palace bodyguards or elephant keepers or gardeners, there was field work also. And then there was those who were descendants of soldiers may have worked like in the African Cavalry Guard in Hyderabad. They were still the cavalry of the Nizam of Hyderabad. And they would ride on horseback and escort him in different processions. So they held on to the jobs as soldiers, and some of them held high positions also. But in Gujarat, the soldier, the military soldier, more or less was transmuted quickly into other positions of palace bodyguard, or just maybe local police for the ruler of the state. And Rajpipla, where Baba Ghosh shrine is, they had definitely a community of Siddhis working for them. And they gave the land of the shrine to Siddhis as an inam or award.
Yeah.
And I just recollect the first year, that means 2-3 years back, Neelima Jayachandran and Amy, they visited Kerala. And Neelima is very curious to know about one Kapiri Tangal. And she visited our college asking about Kapiri Tangal. And we have a lot of Tangal nearby Malappuram and many other parts of the Malabar. But we are not aware about this Kapiri Tangal.
What is Tangal? What is Tangal?
Tangal means Sayyids. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So we brought her to visit the Mamburam Mosque, and that's also connected to the Halarami, the Sayyid Alavil Mamfurami, and he was from Halaramaut.
Oh, okay.
So also remote influence there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yes, I mean, I think Amy and Behrouz and I, we belong to a network some time ago which looked at Africans in the Indian Ocean. We tried to find scholars and Africans in the Indian Ocean. And we found that there were Africans, people were telling us about communities. One I remember is in Bhopal, where the disaster was, the chemical disaster was. So like that. And historically, there have been in Bihar as well, one of the poorest states in India. So
that's far from the coast.
One question I have is, why shouldn't they be everywhere? Is it that their color makes it easier for them to integrate into southern India, southern parts like Tamil Nadu or whatever? Is it that in the northern parts they would be more conspicuous? So there are all kinds of questions you can ask,
Mm-hmm.
Why are they only limited to, say, Gujarat or today, Karnataka,
Well, there's so much intermarrying. And even in Mumbai, for example, they marry other Muslims. So they are also losing some of their phenotype. They're losing, the hair is straight. Perhaps even the skin color changes. And intermarrying means that they are assimilating more into the Muslim culture and not identifying so much with the Siddhi community then. It even kind of perhaps there's social mobility and there is upward mobility. So then they tend to identify less. But then there's another issue which Farida Al-Mubarak in Gujarat told me about, is that there are other communities who are claiming Siddhi status in order to get government benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And that, she says, is posing a huge problem.
Yes. This is the problem when you have several poor, impoverished communities in countries. They always ask me, why do you research Africans? What about others?
Mm-hmm.
So special. But I had to tell them it's the special history that they have, the slave trade, one of the worst things happened in the world, the history of the ruthlessness of the slave trade. The way they were uprooted and brought, dispersed, just planted elsewhere. No connections, the sudden shock.
Yes, this rootlessness, I think, is the major trauma that most of these communities have gone through, being displaced and having to adjust to the language, to the caste system, to the color system. Yeah, it has been a huge problem, no doubt.
What do you think in India is the position of, say, human rights of the Siddhis? Do they have access to education, to healthcare, etc.?
In those who got the benefits of going into the police force or going into government jobs, their children are now educated in Gujarat. They hold a BA or a BCom. I know that there is a young woman who is an attorney, another woman who is training to be a gynecologist. And the parents were placed in a good position in some of the government jobs, particularly in the police force. I met some people in Jamnagar whose children are getting a very good education. So in that sense, they're going to be integrated into the mainstream. How much they will continue to identify with their culture as Siddhis is yet to be something that needs to be researched. In Uttara Kannada also, there are now people who are working towards a PhD or I know 2 young women who are PhDs in sociology, and they are slowly bringing kind of amelioration to their communities in different ways, rather than sports or whatever was traditionally done. So it now remains to be researched. How is the younger generation going to relate to their culture and to their music or, religious rituals, etc.?
But if they want to go to school, do they have a school that they can go to nearby? Are there enough places for them or not?
Well, there are definitely public schools that they go to, but I think the present generation wants to go to private schools. They want a better education. There are very few who are actually going.
Fascinating discussion on various aspects. I'm delighted to be here.
So,
and the same with hospitals. If they fall ill and they choose to go to Western medicine, they have access to hospitals.
They are going to private hospitals. Very few would go to a government hospital if they're really very, very poor, because the services are not up to the mark, definitely. And in fact, some of them want to go abroad. Juje Siddhi, who I work very closely with, he wants his son to go and study abroad. And he is now studying in one of the technical colleges for his BA in BA in computer science. So they want to integrate. They want that upward mobility. They don't want to be holy fakirs anymore. They don't want that status. And it's understandable that modernity is catching up with them. What that means in terms of cultural heritage, we don't know yet, especially the learning of the Malunga, where Iqbal Siddhi, one of the last players, I think, Malang Bhai, Salang Bhai, and Iqbal were the 3 main. Rumana Ben in Ahmedabad played the Malunga. They've all gone. So now who is going to there is one man in Bijapur who plays the Malunga. He is also old.
And Wasim Jamadar, he's a bit younger.
Wasim is there, yes. Wasim is there, and Iqbal's son, Afzal. But the motivation is there in Wasim to even learn the Nangas, which he bought when he was in Africa, the lyre, the Nubian lyre. And he's very active. He jams with other groups and keeps the Malunga alive. Afzal is very caught up in running his father's tea shop So I don't know how much he is practicing. I haven't been in touch with him since his father passed away. But clearly, this will be an important part of the legacy that I hope, if Wasim is the only one, some other younger people will pick it up. Farooq in Ahmedabad is capable of also playing the malunga. He is Rumana Ben's nephew. So
how do they see their heritage? How do they identify with Africa?
I don't know that they identify with Africa. They identify with a memory of Africa and a connection that is an imagined connection to Africa. Not so much that this is the geography to which they are connected, but it's a imagined connection that they are from there. These are their ancestors, and that gives them some, I guess, sense of relationship to a larger area, a larger geography. They are definitely much more focused on daily living, a decent job, education, learning skills, things like that.
A bit like Rastafari in Abyssinia, Rastafari in Ethiopia, and nobody really wants to go to Ethiopia.
Yeah, but reggae music has now caught up with the Siddhis of Uttara Kannada, the young people.
It became a model.
Rap
format.
and yes, right, rap and reggae. And they are coming up with their own rap. And one of the scholars, Shihan is working with, Sofia Pequino, is going to work on that new music coming out of Uttara Kannada with young people who have found a new way to identify, I suppose, with the Afro-Caribbean music, which is their heritage.
Same in Cape Town.
Yes, and even the Sri Lankans, I wasn't at the opening ceremony at the University of Kelaniya of this Ethnomusicology International Council for Traditional Music and Dance, Music and Minorities Conference, a one whole week conference, which Neil presented a paper on the Indian Ocean, African music. And in that, the opening ceremony, they actually sang Miriam Makeba's Pata Pata and Malaika. And when they told me they were singing, I asked them, who asked you to sing this? And they said, nobody, we sing. It's us. We just wanted to sing. And now they're publicly in their program with manjas, slow chants. They are introducing East African music. So the music, that's what UNESCO talks about in intangible cultural heritage. They don't want it to be frozen as in a museum piece. Culture is living culture. It's evolving all the time. In order to survive, it has to change. But it's interesting that they've now never been to that part of East Africa. They've only been to South Africa, Johannesburg. And they are identifying with Africa through music. It's not even imagined, it's real, isn't it? Because they're singing, they're importing it. And it will become part of the heritage of some future generations of Afro Sri Lankans, because that's what this generation is going to pass on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Their children. Perhaps more popular than the traditional manjas, because that's what's happening. The manjas itself, they say it's Portuguese, but it's not. They think they're singing in Portuguese, but they're not always singing in Portuguese. So this is why the older ones are in African languages, and they have composed new manjas when they learned Portuguese, in Sri Lanka, Creole Portuguese.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't know that because both languages, African languages and Portuguese is now, both are foreign to them.
Right.
Because they don't speak Portuguese.
Right.
Yeah.
So anything else that we need to discuss? Any other questions?
Hungry or sleepy, maybe.
For Shihan, it's
and Fred.
It's
Well,
bedtime.
Shihan and Fred, it's close to 12:30.
and Hasib.
And Hasib, oh yeah, of course.
I don't know where Jing is.
Well, Beirut must have got up very early.
Not very early, but 6:30.
Okay, yeah. But you must have set your alarm at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
And made sure you had your morning coffee before.
Yes.
So I think we have to thank Neil for sharing and
Yes.
spending hours with us discussing our book.
Yeah, and thank you for giving the opportunity and inviting. And thank you all for your contributions to the debate and attending.
Yeah.
And
This was
Hasib, especially for the contribution.
yeah, from Kerala. Young scholar from Kerala.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.